This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. President Donald Trump's second term is underway. In a flurry of executive orders, he reverses key Biden directives, including pulling the U.S. out of the WHO and Paris Climate Accord. But he held back from imposing immediate tariffs. Meanwhile, regional leaders congratulate President Trump, urging closer ties. China signals readiness for dialogue, while Japan's prime minister stresses the shared goal of freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. And an unprecedented move, Marco Rubio, picked as U.S. Secretary of State, will be the first China-sanctioned official to handle relations with Beijing. We break down the implications. And President Trump also delays a TikTok ban by 75 days, but threatens tariffs on China if Beijing does not approve a deal to divest the app's U.S. operations. Plus, South Korea's impeached president faces the Constitutional Court for the first time, declaring his firm commitment to free democracy and pledging to answer all questions. Also in East Asia tonight, Vietnam benefited from Trump tariffs on China during his first term. But could Hanoi be the next target for the White House? Donald Trump has returned to the White House with a bang, signing a raft of new orders, including one that delays a ban on TikTok so that the app, owned by a Chinese firm, can find a new owner in the U.S. Well, supporters at the Capital One Arena cheered the newly sworn-in leader as he cancelled 78 executive actions of the Biden administration. President Trump launched a crackdown on immigration, withdrew the U.S. from international agreements, and pardoned hundreds of people charged in the 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol.
With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. It's all about common sense.
Now, Mr. Trump did not announce any China-specific tariffs on his first day in office. Instead, he ordered officials to look into unfair trade practices and investigate if Beijing's kept to the rules of a deal signed during his first term in 2020. But he did say he expects to slap 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada on 1st of February. Benji Haya with more on President Trump's first orders.
Events tonight in Washington were dramatic, performative, a piece of theatre. But don't be fooled into thinking this was just for show. There will be substantive implications from the president's actions. Donald Trump entered the arena brandishing a binder containing executive orders to sign in front of a crowd of 20,000 supporters. Among the measures, a withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, an international treaty aimed at tackling global warming. Another rescinding dozens of Biden administration policies, and more pertaining to the freedom of speech, gender diversity, and ending what the president calls the weaponization of government. Next to the Oval Office, where President Trump laid out a slew of orders, including declaring a national emergency at the southern border, sending troops to deter illegal immigration. He also plans to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America and extend the period for TikTok to stay active stateside after a ban on the app went into effect on Sunday. Then the headline announcement.
So this is January 6th. These are the hostages. Approximately 1,500 for a pardon.
Yes.
Full pardon.
Full pardon or commutations?
Full pardon. We have about 6 commutations in there where we're doing further research.
Okay.
Nice to see you again.
And you.
So this is a big one. Anything you want to explain about this? We hope they get them. We hope they come out tonight, frankly.
That's in pardoning 1,500 defendants who were convicted after storming the heart of American democracy 4 years ago in a bid to subvert the peaceful transfer of power in the last election. He refers to those prisoners as hostages who could now be freed. This merely hours after his own inauguration ceremony at the very site of that deadly riot on January 6, 2021. Only this time, he won the election, and with that, a huge mandate to carry out his MAGA agenda.
From this moment on, America's decline is over. Our liberties and our nation's glorious destiny will no longer be denied, and we will immediately restore the integrity, competency, and loyalty of America's government.
In his speech at the US Capitol, President Trump presented an America First image, regaining autonomy on energy, the border, even space exploration. He said he hopes he's remembered as a peacemaker, though his rhetoric has been more expansionist than non-interventionist. He calls the US a growing nation, pledging to expand its territory and take back control of the Panama Canal. This, he says, is the start of a golden age for America. Meanwhile, former President Joe Biden cast a flurry of last-minute pardons for his family members on Monday, as well as a handful of high-profile critics of Donald Trump, an effort to shield them from the retribution of the 47th president. Benji Haya, CNA, Washington.
The U.S. Senate, meantime, has unanimously confirmed Marco Rubio as President Trump's Secretary of State. He succeeds Antony Blinken as America's top diplomat. Mr. Rubio is the first Trump pick to be confirmed, with lawmakers backing the Republican senator's nomination in a 99-0 vote. Well, the unanimous vote is unusual in today's highly polarized U.S. politics. The 53-year-old is known for his hardline approach on countries such as China and Iran. And at his confirmation hearing last week, he said that China will remain the biggest threat to American prosperity in the 21st century. And that prompted Beijing to slam what it calls unwarranted attacks against China. Mr. Rubio will have to contend with Russia's war in Ukraine and tensions in the Middle East. He will be heading straight to work, meeting later today with top diplomats from the security group Quad. That's Japan, India, and Australia. And for more insights, we are joined by Stephen Nagy. He is Professor of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. Well, welcome to East Asia Tonight, Prof. First, I just want to get your reaction to these executive orders and what are the implications, on some of the executive orders signed today, pulling out of international treaties such as the Paris Climate Accord. We've got the WHO. What can we expect over the next 4 years?
Well, there's a lot to unpackage here, but I think first and foremost, he's come in organized. He has a vision of where he'd like to take the country. And of course, he has all three pillars of American government behind him. This means that he can immediately make some choices and engage in some radical changes that he couldn't do in his first term as president back in 2017. WHO, Paris Climate Accords, rejecting these accords is a strong, strong rebuke, I think, of China and other countries that have really pushed the United States in different directions and challenged international institutions. The United States feels these international institutions are not working in America's favor and as a result rejects them. Where are we going? Of course, American first. We're going to see transactional diplomacy, and we're going to see the United States under President Trump use its most powerful weapon, its economy, to pressure allies and adversaries to change their behavior.
All right, and we've got China hawk Marco Rubio's the historic appointment as U.S. Secretary of State. But he's also at the same time sanctioned by China, right? So how will that status affect relations with Beijing? And essentially, does that signal that there's going to be a more confrontational approach to diplomacy?
Well, I think that Mr. Trump, through Marco Rubio, who has a long track record of really arguing against communism and pushing back against some of the human rights abuses and other challenges that come from communist states like China, he has made controversial statements about Taiwan, supporting Taiwan in the inclusion of international organizations. He has suggested that Taiwan could be an independent state. These are the reddest of red lines for Beijing, and this will be highly controversial within China. Beijing is likely to react through patience, through watching its words, and ensuring that it's watching what the United States actually does rather than what they actually say. And I think that's most important, not only for China, but to watch, but for all of United States allies and adversaries. What do they do rather than what they say? Because if we look at the track record of Mr. Trump and his past administration, he was willing to negotiate. He was willing to find compromise with both allies and adversaries, and that the rhetoric that he used was somewhat less of a reality than what was the compromise that came out in negotiations.
That's right. I guess it's not a surprise then. I mean that, President Trump actually chose to hold off immediate tariffs on China, for instance. Instead he called for a study on issues like unfair trade practices, deficits, currency manipulation, all of that. Does this signal that this could possibly open up a channel of negotiation and dialogue when it comes to trade policy with China?
Well, I think Mr. Trump's strategy is to attack, and never declare failure or losing, and always declare victory. And I think this sentiment is pushing his negotiation tactics. And what we're likely to see, and we've already seen it, he's raised the specter of tariffs on close allies like Canada and Mexico, 25% to be exact. And if you're sitting in Beijing and you're wondering what's going on in the mind of President Trump, when he's actually putting tariffs on closest friends, you're likely thinking that the worst is yet to come in terms of the tariffs that are coming to Beijing. So I think they also understand that Mr. Trump's initial negotiating asks are very high, and then he comes down to some kind of middle ground. So again, I think that Beijing, but also other allies and adversaries of the United States, are watching the rhetoric, looking for that middle ground that they can come to some kind of negotiated settlement and push forward through some proactive and calm diplomacy. Whether that will work or not this time, I'm not so sure, because again, all three pillars of government are behind Mr. Trump. He has a relatively strong mandate. And again, unlike many administrations over the past 30 years, a strong vision of where he'd like to take the United States.
Yeah, so, what we're also watching out for is Trump with a possible visit to China this year, something that he's hinted. And if that happens, do you think some of the key issues likely to dominate the agenda would be like trade, for instance?
Trade, of course. Fentanyl will be there. Of course, positions on China's more assertive behavior in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. It really will depend on the dynamics moving forward and how successful he is in making those executive orders come a reality. The first 100 days, 3-4 months of the presidency is really important in terms of gathering momentum and demonstrating that he can translate those words into actual policies that are changing the lives of Americans and making alliances stronger, or making it much more difficult for adversaries. And if he does continue the momentum that he has currently, it's going to put him in a very strong position in terms of trade negotiations with China, strong demands over fentanyl and other issues that are in disagreement between the two countries. But he also may step back on some of the security agreements or security commitments that he's made in the region. There's a lot going on in this puzzle. And I think that, again, we have to wait and see how successful he is over the next 100 days or longer.
Also, given these developments, we've got Rubio's appointment, Trump's evolving trade strategies, China's counter moves, right? How do you think China might adjust its approach to the U.S. and the sort of strategic recalibration that Beijing is considering right now?
Well, they've already started, to be frank. Before he was elected, the Chinese already reached out to the Australians. They reached out to the Indians and came to an agreement over the disagreements on the Himalayan plateau. We saw the Japanese foreign minister, Mr. Iwaya, in Beijing on Christmas Day, and the Japanese have given a 10-year visa to eligible Chinese citizens. There's even talk in Tokyo about a state visit by Xi Jinping to Tokyo. So they've reached out, they've tried to warm relations. I think they're practicing what I call economy of enemies. They just can't deal with the United States and the pressure that the Trump administration is going to ramp up on Beijing while having complicated relations with South Korea, with Japan, with Southeast Asian countries, with India, Australia, etc. So they're really reaching out to try and warm relations with potential partners of Washington. Second, they've loosened the trade restrictions and opened up their economy to massively export abroad prior to tariffs coming in. So to front load some of the pain that's going to come and boost the economy before the real pain starts. And they've also made some commitments to limiting the supply of gallium and other critical minerals that are important for technology and different industries. So they have some leverage, but ultimately, China is an exporter and exports about $700 to $800 billion of trade to the United States. And that is huge leverage on the U.S. side. If they stop that trade, it's going to affect an already hurting Chinese economy.
Always good speaking with you. Thanks so much for your insights there. Stephen Nagy, Professor of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. Well, leaders from around the world are congratulating Mr. Trump on his return to the White House, with many calling for closer ties over the next 4 years. China's foreign ministry says that Beijing is willing to strengthen dialogue and communication with Washington and manage their differences, in hopes the two sides can jointly promote the stable development of economic and trade relations. Well, Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee said that Mr. Trump's return to the White House marks a new starting point for China-US relations to progress. But he also warned against what he calls political interference.
We believe what we do is for the overall good of Hong Kong. And if there's any attempt to interfere with trials in Hong Kong, or officials or people who are involved in administering justice, it won't work.
Taiwan President William Lai also offered his best wishes to Mr. Trump. He called the U.S. an important security, economic and trade partner, as well as a strong ally that shares the values of democracy and freedom. South Korea's acting president Chae Sang-mok congratulated Mr. Trump while making a play on his Make America Great Again slogan. Mr. Choi also highlighted the impact U.S. trade policies will have on the South Korean economy and electric vehicle industry. Meantime, fellow Quad member and key security ally Japan touted Tokyo's enduring ties with Washington. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba highlighted their joint goal of freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific amid tensions with China in a disputed East China Sea. Right, time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Trump's latest executive order affecting the EV battery market and his threats of tariffs also raising concerns among investors for Asian automakers. Plus, South Korea's exports fall for the first 20 days this month, threatening a month of negative growth after more than a year of expansion. Hello again. Glad to have your company on East Asia Tonight. Well, let's get to Roland Lim now for some updates from the business world. And Roland, looks like it's a reprieve for TikTok with a delay in that ban. But what are some of the strings attached?
Yes, so Shelley, it does seem that Donald Trump is using the move to secure a deal on U.S. ownership of the short video app. Now, on his first day in office, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to keep TikTok ticking for another 75 days in the U.S. But the reprieve comes with a caveat. The new U.S. president expects Chinese parent company ByteDance to sell its stake in the app or face a ban in the country.
I may not do the deal, or I may do the deal. TikTok is worthless. Worthless if I don't approve it. It has to close. I learned that from the people that own it. If I don't do the deal, it's worthless, worth nothing. If I do the deal, it's worth maybe $1 trillion, $1 trillion. So if I do the deal I'm talking about doing it for the United States. If I do the deal for the United States, then I think we should get half.
President Trump also warned he would impose significant tariffs on China if Beijing fails to approve a deal regarding the app, which he said would be, quote, a hostile act. He said the tariffs could be as high as 100%. Now, China was one of 3 countries Trump threatened to hit tariffs with. He said that he could impose levies of up to 25% on Canada and Mexico from February the 1st. But he did not enact sweeping 60% levies on Chinese imports as he had promised during the election campaign. The short video app service used by 170 million Americans, was briefly taken offline for U.S. users on Saturday following the initial deadline, but resumed service hours later. The executive order effectively buys 75 days for the administration to explore alternative solutions to address the app's data privacy concerns without resorting to an outright ban. But experts say a Trump executive order may face legal roadblocks as it cannot override a law that Congress has passed and that the Supreme Court has upheld. Checking market reaction out of China to that mass of executive orders out of the White House. Our Chinese stocks ended a volatile day, largely higher. Analysts say investors are still struggling to make sense of the U.S. president's plans for China. Trump reinforced optimism that he will treat China less harshly than markets had feared. He unexpectedly held off tariffs on the country and did not single it out as a threat. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index ending the day 0.9% in the green. And on the mainland, the benchmark indices today flat for Shanghai at 3,242 points. Second most Shenzhen component is up by 0.5%. Shares of Chinese EV maker BYD rising 1.7% after Trump revoked Biden's 50% electric vehicle target by 2030. And checking in on the Chinese currency, the renminbi is strong against the greenback by 0.26%, $1 giving you 7.282 yuan. Yesterday, it rebounded to the strongest level in 2 weeks after a friendly phone call between Mr. Trump and President Xi Jinping. It had weakened to roughly 3% against the dollar since Mr. Trump's victory. Automakers and equity markets in East Asia remained volatile following U.S. President Donald Trump's inauguration speech after he revoked the previous administration's executive order on electric vehicles. Shares of Mazda and Honda ended in the red today, but they're also watching Trump's tariff threats on Mexico. Japan's third biggest automaker, Nissan, has 2 plants in Mexico and exports about 300,000 vehicles to the U.S. each year. Honda, meanwhile, sends 80% of its Mexican output to the U.S. market. Toyota also has 2 plants which produce pickup trucks for the U.S. market. Japan's finance minister says his country will respond appropriately after examining Mr. Trump's policies. In South Korea, shares of major automaker Hyundai closing nearly 1% lower. The firm also has operations in Mexico. Rival Kia unchanged for the day. Drastic declines, though, for South Korean battery makers amid worries about how policy shifts under Trump could squeeze big manufacturers in the region. The biggest loser of the lot is LG Energy Solutions. It's down by more than 4%, followed by Samsung SDI. Now, Panama has begun auditing a Hong Kong company that operates ports at the either ends of the canal, as new U.S. President Donald Trump warns that he would take back the waterway over alleged Chinese influence. Now, Panama's Comptroller General Office, in an apparent nod to Mr. Trump, published a video on social media platform X of about 10 men and women heading into the local offices of Hong Kong-based Hutchison ports. Mr. Trump has repeated criticisms he made in recent weeks about the Panama Canal during his inauguration speech. The canal handles about 3% of the world's seaborne trade each year. Authorities say the auditors will carry out an extensive inspection to guarantee efficient and transparent use of public resources. The firm is the ports arm of Hong Kong-listed conglomerate CK Hutchison Holdings. Now, the arm operates some 53 ports in more than 20 countries, including the UK and Germany. It won the concessions to handle 2 ports at each end of the Panama Canal in 1997. The concessions were renewed in 2021. China does not control the canal, but some officials in Washington are increasingly concerned about the presence of Chinese firms in the area. Meantime, Panama union workers marched to the U.S. ambassador's residence in the capital to protest Mr. Trump's threats, saying that Washington should not infringe on the country's sovereignty. South Korea's exports fell in the first 20 days of January as compared to a year ago. With Lunar New Year holidays coming up, the country looks set to break a 15-month streak of export growth for the full month. Outbound shipments fell more than 5%, reversing January's increase of close to 7%. Now, officials attribute this to fewer working days during the month. But semiconductor exports continued on the upswing, jumping more than 19%, reflecting the global cycle. That's in contrast with vehicle shipments, which shed more than 7%, and petroleum products, which plunged close to 30%. Now, exports to Vietnam rose, but those to China, its top trading partner, as well as the US, it did fall. South Korea's trade figures are closely watched as a global bellwether, as one of the earliest industrial nations to report data. And you're up to date with the business news. Oteli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for another break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Donald Trump calls North Korea a nuclear power, triggering concerns in the South that the U.S. could shift its long-standing goal of denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. You're watching East Asia tonight. President Donald Trump's second term is underway. In a flurry of executive orders, he reverses key Biden directives, including pulling the U.S. out of the WHO and Paris Climate Accord, but he held back from imposing immediate tariffs. Meanwhile, regional leaders congratulate President Trump, urging closer ties. China signals readiness for dialogue, while Japan's prime minister stresses the shared goal of freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. And President Trump also delays a TikTok ban by 75 days, but threatens tariffs on China if Beijing does not approve a deal to divest the app's U.S. operations. Mr. Trump, meantime, has doubled down on his expansionist threats, vowing to, quote, take back the Panama Canal. He repeated his claim that Chinese soldiers are operating that strategic waterway, a claim that the Panamanian president, José Raúl Mulino, denied. Well, the U.S. built the Panama Canal and handed it over to Panama in a 1977 treaty which allows any nation to use the canal. While Panama maintains control of the canal, Chinese companies have been increasing their presence around the vital shipping link.
American ships are being severely overcharged and not treated fairly in any way, shape, or form, and that includes the United States Navy. And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
Well, Panamanian President Mulino dismissed Mr. Trump's claims and repeated that the canal is and will remain Panama's. And for more, we are joined now by CNA's Tan Sihui in Beijing. First up, Sihui, I thought that the reactions in China are relatively muted on the first day of Trump's presidency. Do we know what other responses or opinions are emerging from China?
So indeed, it seems like it's business as usual in China, although state media just reported that Chinese President Xi Jinping had a video call with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, although not much information has come out of that video call. But observers are telling me, and they're saying that both sides are likely to be reaffirming their friendship ahead of the fact that Mr. Trump has come into the White Office again, and they're saying that the international context has changed, and so they're coming again together. But as we heard in his speech on Monday, we did not hear anything about foreign policy or tariffs when it comes to China, but one thing we heard a lot about was the Panama Canal. You heard Mr. Trump going at length saying that and accusing China of operating the Panama Canal, and he's saying that he wants to take control of it. And then Chinese state media, they have run an article and stating what Panama president has said, and he has said that no country is interfering in its administration, and it clearly still belongs to Panama. And so observers are saying that this is a widely debated issue in the U.S., especially since it's reported that the U.S. Navy has special rights access to the canal. Let's take a listen.
There's been a question about national security there. I suppose these are the elements that Trump is harking back to. But whether they are a real problem or a real concern for the United States and its interests, or whether it's just something that Trump wants to do because it's lucrative, that is not so clear at this point in time.
I also spoke to some residents on the ground beyond the Panama Canal. They're also having some reservations about Trump taking office again, but they are hopeful that China-U.S. relations are off to a fresh start, and they're hopeful for a wonderful relationship ahead.
是他就职的时候韩正去的，对吧？韩正去的啊，所以我觉得这是一个这可能是一个前奏吧，一个预兆。
中美呢是一种博弈，说白了有竞争有合作，因为他我们世界经济体排名第2，他也担心赶超我们，但我们这种东西是要克制理性。
因为我只是比较在意个人的这个所谓的人生的发展，所以他这个再任1次、2次或者3次，只要没有做出特别针对中国的这个政策，我觉得好像都 OK。
And overall, response is relatively muted in China. Observers are also saying that China is likely to hold their cards close to their chest and they don't want to unnecessarily provoke Mr. Trump.
Well, let's talk about Marco Rubio. He's the new U.S. Secretary of State. We know that he's generally taken a hawkish stance towards China. So what do you think the next 4 years is going to be like?
Exactly. I mean, in September, Mr. Rubio, he had said in an opinion piece that China is the U.S.'s largest, most advanced adversary in the U.S. that the U.S. has ever faced. And so we can imagine observers are saying that there's a lot of potential for volatility in the next 4 years.
While Rubio is Secretary of State, and that's an important role, the Secretary of State does not, by himself, call the shots on foreign policy or all external policy. There are other stakeholders here. There's the Defense Department, there's the Commerce Department, and also the other kinds of advisors that Trump has brought on board, people like Elon Musk. Now, they all have very, very different views on foreign policy and very different views on the PRC and how the relationship with the U.S. should go. So that suggests that there will be some debate, potentially even infighting.
Well, China is likely to ready itself for the next 4 years. But then again, Mr. Rubio is not an unknown entity. He's been very prominent on China-related issues in the U.S. Senate. But at the same time, the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry, what it had to say about Mr. Rubio's appointment is that it will firmly safeguard its national interest. And it says that, and it urges officials from both sides to maintain contact in an appropriate manner.
All right. Many thanks for that report. CNA's Tan Si-hui in Beijing. Now, in other news, South Korea's acting president, Choi Sang-mok, says that he hopes relations with the U.S. can develop more reciprocally under Trump's presidency. Mr. Choi cited concerns around how new U.S. policies could affect Seoul and hopes to have a phone call with the new president as soon as possible. South Korea's defense ministry, meantime, has stressed that denuclearizing North Korea must continue to be the goal for lasting global peace. That's after Mr. Trump referred to Pyongyang as a nuclear power shortly after he was sworn in as president.
I think North Korea turned out to be good. I was very friendly with him. He liked me. I liked him. We got along very well. They thought that was a tremendous threat. Now, he is a nuclear power. But we got along. I think he'll be happy to see him coming back.
Well, there is speculation around whether Mr. Trump will revive diplomacy with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. He had 3 in-person meetings with Mr. Kim during his first term as president, including the first-ever summit in Singapore in 2018. Washington has generally been reluctant to refer to North Korea as a nuclear power on the risk that it could hinder non-proliferation efforts. Well, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has called on Mr. Trump to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific region, among other mutually beneficial goals.
その国益を両方生かしながら世界平和あるいは世界経済そういうものにどうこの二国間の関係を生かすことができるかということを中心に真摯な議論を行い信頼関係を確立したいというふうに考えておるところでございます。
Japan is hoping to set up a meeting between its leader and President Trump as soon as possible. The two are key defense allies and each other's top foreign investors. Now, Tokyo is wary after Mr. Trump spoke of a tariff on all countries on top of the planned levies on Mexico and Canada. Japanese Foreign Minister Takeshi Iwaya will meet newly minted Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Washington this week. Mr. Iwaya is expected to lay down issues that Japan considers non-negotiable. And this includes strengthening extended deterrence, where the U.S. is expected to defend its allies with all its capabilities, including the use of nuclear weapons. The Japan-administered Senkaku Islands, which are also claimed by China as Diaoyu Islands, are also non-negotiable for Tokyo. Time now for another short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, we'll tell you why Vietnam is a prime target for new trade tariffs under Donald Trump's presidency. U.S. President Donald Trump laid out plans to expand American territory even before returning to power. Among his ideas is buying Greenland, something that he first raised in 2019. Well, the island is an autonomous territory of Denmark, but Mr. Trump says that America needs it to ensure international security. Well, he believes Denmark will, quote, come along on his plans to purchase Greenland. CNA's Clara Lee tells us why Mr. Trump is so keen on the Arctic island.
This is Greenland. It's covered in ice, sparsely populated, and an autonomous territory that's part of Denmark. While the Greenland government has control over domestic issues, Denmark remains responsible for its national defense. So what makes this territory so attractive? Well, if you look at this map, you'll see the countries bordering the Arctic Circle. Among them, Canada, the US through Alaska, and Russia as well. This is becoming a key area for commercial ocean traffic because of the Northwest Passage. The sea lane has been closed for most of human history, but it's opening up due to global warming. And when it does, it will be the most direct route to Europe and Asia from North America. Owning Greenland would give the US easier access to this passage. But a strategic location is not the only thing going for the world's largest island. It's also rich in mostly untapped natural resources. 25 out of 34 minerals deemed critical by the European Commission can be found there. It's clear that there are many reasons for US President Donald Trump to want Greenland. So what are his options? For now, he needs to convince both Denmark and the government of Greenland to sell. And winning over Denmark won't be easy. Following Mr. Trump's latest bid to buy the island, the Danish king updated the royal coat of arms, making the part that represents Greenland more prominent. The Danish prime minister also made her stance clear. Mette Frederiksen says Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders. Okay, so what do they want? Well, the 57,000 people living there seem divided. Some believe aligning with a superpower might be good for their economy. Others insist the island is not for sale. But most of them agree on one thing, the need for independence.
Vi vil ikke være danskere, vi vil ikke være amerikanere, vi vil selvfølgelig være grønlændere. Og selvfølgelig er det den grønlandske folk, som bestemmer deres fremtid.
I strongly believe in Greenland's independence. To achieve this, we must expand our collaborations and establish business relationships with countries beyond Denmark.
So far, Trump hasn't named his price, but we can do some back-of-the-napkin math to estimate how much he'd offer. Let's take a look at past purchases. The U.S. acquired Alaska from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million. That's about $150 million today. They also bought the Danish West Indies, now known as the Virgin Islands, from Denmark in 1917 for $25 million, which would be about $657 million in 2025. A real estate developer and former economist at the New York Fed crunched the numbers, and after adjusting for the 500-fold growth in Denmark Denmark's GDP since 1917 and the growth in US GDP since 1867, we're looking at a range between 12.5 billion to 77 billion US dollars. We also can't forget other points of leverage. The US president said he's not ruling out trade tariffs on Denmark or the use of military force. But one analyst says Trump may be all bark and no bite.
I think a lot of this is posturing. Certainly he did this in his first term in office, and it didn't really go very far. But now he's raised it again. And I think Greenland, you know, there's both strategic and economic importance to the United States in Greenland. So we'll just have to see how this plays out.
Ultimately, a lot remains uncertain for Greenland. But one thing's for sure, it's currently caught up in an evolving geopolitical storm.
U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly called tariffs the most beautiful word. Well, he said in his inauguration address that he intends to impose them on the U.S.'s trading partners. Will countries wait for him to announce fresh tariffs? CNA's Tong No explains why one of Southeast Asia's most promising economies was always going to be vulnerable.
This garment factory in Vietnam's northern Haiphong city is heavily reliant on the U.S. market for revenue. 60% of the products here is exported to the U.S.
Là hàng bảo hộ y tế, là quần áo cấp cho các bệnh viện, các bác sĩ, các phòng khám. Cho nên là khi cái thời kỳ Covid-19 thì cái nhu cầu về đồng phục y tế tăng đột biến. Cho nên là lượng đơn hàng của chúng tôi rất là lớn. Và chúng tôi đã có thể xuất khẩu tới hàng triệu sản phẩm trên một tháng.
The company has since expanded to serve its American customers. Business has been booming with confidence here at the factory of 1,200 workers until the victory of Donald Trump.
Chúng tôi đang rất là lo lắng, có thể là để cân bằng cái cán cân thương mại của Việt Nam và Mỹ thì Mỹ sẽ có thể điều chỉnh cái mức thuế suất, không phải là để cho các mặt hàng Việt Nam không được nhập khẩu sang bên Mỹ nữa, mà đang cân bằng lại cái trị giá xuất khẩu và nhập khẩu từ thị trường Việt Nam sang bên Mỹ.
The U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam was the fourth highest, more than 100 billion US dollars. And many are wondering if Vietnam will be next, since Mr. Trump already said he would impose tariffs on imports from countries after he was elected.
Trump has two metrics in particular that he cares a lot about. The first is what he calls the bilateral trade deficit in goods. So he's not interested in services. It's really about trade in goods. And the second is he's got a concern about currency levels. And unfortunately, Vietnam has problems on both of those. It's got one of the largest trade deficits, again, viewed from Washington, that puts it firmly in Trump's crosshairs for some kind of retaliatory actions. And then second, it has a currency that, again, viewed from Washington, or at least viewed from Trump's White House, is going to look terribly undervalued. And so from Trump's perspective, this is two giant black marks against Vietnam that will probably mean Vietnam is going to be pretty high up in that list of countries that he wants to attack early.
Ironically, when Mr. Trump imposed tariffs on imports from China during his first term in office, Vietnam was among the countries that reaped the most gains. The Trump administration announced tariffs on Chinese imports in the second half of 2018, which turned out to be good for Vietnam.
Bởi vì Việt Nam thì tiếp giáp với cả các trung tâm sản xuất công nghiệp lớn của Trung Quốc, đặc biệt là những mặt hàng như điện tử, thì về cơ bản Việt Nam hoàn toàn có một cái lợi thế và có lẽ là không một địa điểm sản xuất nào trên thế giới có thể cạnh tranh được về yếu tố vị trí địa lý đó.
That didn't go unnoticed by then President Trump. When asked about the trend of companies moving to Vietnam and whether he would impose tariffs on Vietnam, he said his administration was in discussion with Vietnam. He went on to call Vietnam almost the single worst abuser of everybody. And he even said Vietnam takes advantage of the US worse than China. Vietnam eventually emerged unscathed from the first Trump presidency. In fact, in 2019, the year after tariffs on China was announced, foreign direct investment into Vietnam peaked, increasing more than 7% year on year to hit a record 38 billion US dollars, a level which remains unbeaten today.
Vietnam did very well out of Trump 1. They attracted an awful lot of inbound investment, including out of China, but also firms that had previously been in China. Many of them had already been looking at Vietnam before the Trump administration came into office, but that certainly his trade war accelerated production in Vietnam. And you can see that in the figures right now, where Vietnam's trade with the US has simply exploded over the last 8 years. So I think Vietnam did well and Trump won. However, and I think this is key, it is unlikely to do anywhere near as well in Trump 2. And in fact, because it's been such a success, in a piece of irony, it's likely to do much worse in Trump 2.
2025 could usher in many unknowns as Mr. Trump takes office. Yet this potential uncertainty in its largest export market and the possible threat of tariffs doesn't appear to have faced the Vietnamese leadership. Vietnam's economy grew by more than 7% last year, beating its own target as well as forecasts by the World Bank and the IMF. And this year, the government has set a high economic growth target of 8 to 10% as the governing Communist Party of Vietnam gears up for an all-important political meeting in January 2026. This may not be entirely unachievable, even given the current global climate.
Vietnam is still a very bright spot in an otherwise gloomy economic picture for a lot of the world. And so even notwithstanding the disruption out of the US, it will remain a very attractive market. And it will especially become an attractive market for other potential investors or firms who are thinking about non-US final destination products, so into Europe, into Asia, etc.
At the factory in Haiphong, the company is playing it a little more cautiously. They say they are trying whatever they can to reduce the risks from Mr. Trump's potential tariffs. They are doubling efforts to increase automation at the factory to reduce costs. And the firm is also looking into other potential markets. Like many other companies in Vietnam, they are bracing for a challenging 2025 with major economic headwinds brought on by Trump 2.0. Tung Ngo, CNA, Hanoi.
South Korea's suspended President Yoon Suk-yeol showed up for the first time today at his impeachment trial. Well, today's session marks the third hearing at the Constitutional Court. The judges will decide whether to remove him from office over his failed bid to impose martial law last month. Mr. Yoon says he is committed to a free democracy and vowed to answer any questions posed by the court. He has denied ordering the military to drag lawmakers out of the National Assembly to prevent them from voting down his emergency decree.
대한민국에서 국회와 언론은 대통령보다 훨씬 강한 초갑입니다. 만약에 제가 무리를 해서 계엄 해제 요구 의결을 못하게 한다 해서 국회 아니라 다른 장소에서도 할 수 있고 그 이후에 얼마든지 계엄 해제 요구를 할 수가 있습니다. 그러고 그거를 만약에 막았다고 한다면 그거는 정말 뒷감당을 할 수 없는 일이라고 저는 생각합니다. 그래서
Mr. Yoon's lawyers say his emergency decree was meant to sound the alarm over the opposition Democratic Party, accusing them of paralyzing the government. Supporters of Mr. Yoon rallied outside the Constitutional Court, voicing their opposition to the proceedings. The protesters also hoping that newly inaugurated U.S. President Donald Trump would offer support to Mr. Yoon in his impeachment case. Well, President Yoon has been detained since last week and is looking at a prolonged period in custody. He faces a separate criminal investigation into allegations of insurrection tied to his martial law bid. And that's all we've got for you in East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can also find us on Facebook and on YouTube. Thanks for watching.